Hi, everyone. Welcome. I'm going to let people filter in. We're about 2 minutes away from 6:30, so I'll let people filter in, and then I might give people a couple minutes after 6:30 too. But thank you for being here. I'm here if you have any questions, but we're going to sit tight for just a little bit. Hi, Molly. Thanks
Hey,
for being
Jen.
here. How are you?
I'm great.
Good. Thanks for being here. I was just telling everyone we're gonna hang out for a little bit. I might give everyone a couple minutes past 6:30 just to finish dinner and tune in. So we're just sitting tight for a little bit.
Sure, no problem.
Welcome, everyone. We are gonna give everyone a couple minutes to filter in. If you're here to learn more about the Bird Migration Explorer and how to use it for advocacy, you're in the right place. But we're going to hold tight and start in maybe just a minute to give people time to finish dinner. All right. Thank you, everyone, for joining us tonight. I'm going to get started. People will probably be filtering in as I get going, so I just have a short little introduction. But thank you so much for joining us tonight for this webinar that I'm really excited about, using the Bird Migration Explorer for advocacy. I was excited about this already, and then Pittsburgh was lucky enough to host Christian Cooper, the author and birder, on the first night of his book tour, which was thrilling. But he was here the other night, and he was talking about how migration patterns add a layer of connectivity to us all that we should really be aware of and that we should latch on to. And that got me even more excited for tonight's webinar. So I am really excited for everyone to be here. I'm excited that that Nat is joining us. This is Nat Seavey. He will be guiding us through the tool tonight. He is the Director of Migration Science with the National Audubon Society. Nat works with the Audubon science team to use the wealth of scientific knowledge about bird migration to engage people in the joy of migration and help them take action to protect the places that matter most across the Americas. For over 25 years, he's worked on birds, wildlife ecology and conservation in North America, Hawaii, Central America, and Africa. And these projects have included research on tropical raptors, forest songbirds, African sunbirds, Pacific seabirds, and migratory birds in Western North Africa. Nat's research has contributed to developing solutions that integrate bird conservation with climate change, forest and wildfire management, river restoration, wildfire-friendly agriculture, and water management. Without further ado, I will hand it over to Nat. I'm going to stop sharing. And you can see there's a Q&A. If you have any questions, I'll be here off camera, but here to help in any way I can. Thanks, Nat.
Thank you, Tess. And thanks everybody for joining. I'm really excited to be here tonight and have a chance to tell you a little bit about the Bird Migration Explorer and give you some ideas about how you might be able to use it in work to do conservation out there for migratory birds. I'll tell you a little bit about myself. Let's see, I grew up in Washington State, and I have spent, much of my life on the West Coast. I live out in California right now. One of the things I really love about my job is the connections it gives me to other places across the hemisphere and the ability to kind of learn about what's important to people and what their local birds are and how they see them. So it's been fun to kind of put this talk together and look at some of the places that are relevant to you. So with that, let me start. I'll share my screen. So tonight, what I wanted to do, I'm going to start out by telling you a little bit about the challenge of conserving migratory birds and why something like the Bird Migration Explorer is important and why it's timely, why we have the ability to do it now. And then I'll go through a few slides that give kind of a high-level introduction to the Bird Migration Explorer in general and what some different pieces of it are. And then we'll switch and I'll do a live demo of the website and we'll look at some species and some places and some conservation challenges that are relevant to the Mid-Atlantic. So that's what we're going to cover. And so, starting with the idea that migratory birds are being lost at an alarming rate. We know that since 1970, there's been almost a 30% decline in North American bird populations. And the work that Audubon scientists have done to show that looking forward into the future under the projected climate change, that we expect that future for migratory birds to be even tougher. And so it's really important that we think about what are the steps that we can do now that can help relieve some of the stresses that migratory birds have felt in the past and also help prepare them more for what's coming in the future. So at the same time, we know that birds also tell us about the health of our environment. And so if we can protect birds in the places they need, we also protect the places that people and other wildlife need. And so thinking about that this is not just bird conservation, this is bird conservation in the context of people and everything that we need to do on the surface of the planet to survive and to make the surface of the planet the place that we want to be. So protecting migratory birds requires us to work across the hemisphere. And this starts to get to that theme that Tess talked a little bit about how migratory birds add this layer of connectivity and really pose both a challenge and an opportunity. So one of our iconic migratory species out west is the Swainson's hawk. It's common in arid lands and also uses agricultural fields a lot in arid lands in the west where it breeds. And then it moves south during migration, travels down through Central America, and then overwinters in parts of Mexico, Central America, and as far south as Argentina. And so there were declines back in the 80s. And one of the things that we learned through migratory bird tracking is that these birds were using agricultural fields on their wintering ground where they were being exposed to pesticides. And so there was the opportunity to put legislation in place and policies that helped restrict those pesticides. And we started to see Swainson's hawks numbers begin to turn around, and really outlines the importance of understanding how birds use the Western Hemisphere, right? Thinking that they're embedded within the places that we use, whether it's our agricultural fields or migrating across the places we live, and that the actions we take in those places have impacts on those birds, and the birds carry those impacts from place to place across the hemisphere. So what's amazing is that we're at a point right now where advances in migration science and technology are helping us understand bird migration in a way that helps us do more impactful conservation. Back when they were working on Swainson's hawks, really the only way to track migratory birds was with relatively large transmitters that were mostly used on raptors and waterfowl. But over the last 10, 15 years, that technology has gotten much smaller, and we've got a number of different technologies now that allow us to track small birds. So I'll tell you a little bit more about that as we go through and look at some other examples tonight. But it's really an exciting time to be doing bird conservation because we have so much more information about the movements that these birds make. So the Bird Migration Explorer combines millions of data shared by hundreds of scientists and institutions to reveal the most complete understanding of where, when, and how we need to act across the hemisphere to protect migratory birds, and also identify knowledge gaps, to look at some of the species where we don't have very much information and recognize that we need more information about where those birds are and what we need to do to protect them. So the Bird Migration Explorer basically is built on these three pieces of information. So we have tracking data in there, so information that is collected from individual birds that have been tracked through a number of different technologies. We've got over 13,000 tracks that covering over 184 species. And then we also have other information on movement that comes from banding data. You might be familiar with banding stations if some of you have visited those or even helped volunteer to run some of those. MODIS, which is another kind of tracking data that basically MODIS, if you have a MODIS tower set up, if a bird has a MODIS tag on it, then it will basically leave a record when it passes by that MODIS station, that MODIS tower. And then genetic connectivity data, which is another way that we're able to track the movements of birds. And this genetic connectivity data is very much like the ancestry data that we have for people, where we can take a sample from a bird, and then if we've sampled it across its breeding range, we can connect a genetic sample from the wintering range to what population we think that bird most likely came from. And then finally, we have range maps, and we have range maps throughout the year. So unlike the field guide, which used to just sort of show breeding, migration, and overwintering, now we have through the eBird products that are produced by the Cornell Lab of Ornithology, we've got these incredible maps of distribution at every week of the month, every week of the year. And we're able to get a sense of where the entire population is through those. And those are all built off of the eBird system. So if any of you have ever submitted an eBird list, that eBird list has been part of generating some of these products that are what make the Explorer so powerful. And then we also have the BirdLife International range maps. And for some of the species that are in areas where we still don't have very much eBird data, these range maps help us fill in the gaps between there. So we have a total of 520 migration studies that have gone into building the Bird Migration Explorer into what it is. And one of the things that has really made this possible, as you might take away from that last slide, is extraordinary partnerships that are among science, conservation, and technology organizations and individual scientists and institutions who have been willing to share their tracking data with us. And so I really just wanted to take a moment and recognize the contribution that all of these partners have made to making the Bird Migration Explorer what it is, and also to all of the individual scientists who have put the effort that it takes into doing the work and the research to understand the movements of migratory birds. So what I'm going to go through now are a few slides that kind of show you, these are just static images of what we'll be looking at when I do the live demo. But this just kind of gives you a sense of some of the pieces before we look at them. So here is the landing page for the Bird Migration Explorer. The landing page has the colored tracks of the different groups of birds. So these are actual tracks that are in the Explorer that you can go in there. And it's amazing to see how these tracks begin to outline the continent across the hemisphere. And those movements of birds are really showing us, the continental definition. The Bird Migration Explorer is organized into three main functions. There's a way to look up bird species and look at the migration of species. There's a way to look at locations and better understand how a location is connected to other places across the hemisphere by the movements of migratory birds. And then there are conservation challenges. And conservation challenges are the human activities that are going on out there that can both be problems and solutions to the future of migratory birds. And so much of what we do, it's not as simple as just threats to migratory birds. It's really thinking about what are the challenges and how do we make sure that everything that we do is helping point us toward a direction that has a better future for migratory birds. So there are a number of different visualizations. A lot of these are around the movements of migratory birds. I'll go through several of these specifically. And then also about connections. So we'll look at some maps like these that help us take one place and then look at how it's connected to other places across the hemisphere by the movements of migratory birds, and then be able to use that information to go into those places and understand a little bit more about them and what's important in those areas. And these help us understand how local actions have hemispheric impacts. And again, thinking about that advocacy, and that when we're going out and pursuing bird conservation in one place, we're really doing that in a context of these movements of migratory birds that cover the entire hemisphere. And then finally, thinking about large-scale conservation issues, and that we need the large-scale solutions to those. So we need to be doing the local work and also doing that local work in the context of that larger scale understanding of where that local work needs to be supported in other areas as well. And so we have the hemispheric maps of conservation challenges that help provide that context. Okay, so with that, I am going to I'm going to switch screens here, and I'm going to go online and walk you through some examples of the Bird Migration Explorer. Okay, so now you should see my screen, and it should show that landing page for the Bird Migration Explorer. Great. See, Tess is giving me the thumbs up. So I wanted to stop here and just kind of show you a few things about the different places. So we get here and we can click on one of these to go explore bird species, locations, or conservation challenges. And then this is going to disappear, but these three same options are going to stay up along the top here if we want to navigate back to any of those. So I'm going to start out at bird species and just give you some examples of what we have for bird species. So we go in here and you can browse through species here, or you could click here to look at different taxonomic groups or look at species by location or data technology or conservation challenges. So different ways to look at species. But what I'm going to do is just search, and I'm going to start by looking up common tern. Okay, so there's common tern. And that takes just a minute to load up. So one of the neat things about the Bird Migration Explorer is that what you're going to see are animations, but these are not just videos, right? So they're not recorded animations, they're actual live. It's going and retrieving the data and building these animations off of the data that's actually there. And what's so great about that is that as more data becomes available, it's very easy for us to go in, add new data to the system, and update these pages. And so in fact, since we launched the Bird Migration Explorer about a year ago, we've already done our first refresh that we've brought in new sets of data. So if you've looked at the Bird Migration Explorer and looked at some of the species, you might want to look back at some of those now, because it's possible that there's new data in there. So here's the page. It starts out playing, and I'm actually going to go ahead and pause it here to stop it for a second and just show you some of the different pieces to it. So we've got a little bit of information about common terns here. We've got the ability to look at 3 different types of maps. We've got the species migration map. That's the one that we're on right now. Then we've got species connection maps, and then conservation challenges maps. So those would all be relevant to the common tern. And then over here, we've got the ability to turn different layers on and off. And so I'm actually going to go ahead and turn a number of these layers off, and I'll just leave on the abundance map there. And then also data providers. And data providers, if you want to look up any information about where the data that on the map came from, you can open up this box and that gives you information here. So in terms of individually tracked birds, like we've got some data here from Annie Bracey, and that's probably the light level geolocator data. And we've got some here from the MODIS system. So that's kind of a fun place to look if you want to know more about the individual data sets that come in there. So right now I've got the tracking data turned off. And so I can zoom in just a little bit and I'll start this playing. And so what we're going to start by looking at here, and it might take just a little bit of time for these to load up, but it's going to show us just the abundance maps. And so the abundance maps come from those Cornell data. There go the names in there. And so those are the eBird maps that show weekly distribution for the species. So you can see these showing up here in the hexagons. And the larger the hexagons, the more abundant the species is within that area. And so then as we see the months go by, we can see them move down here and disperse out. They're kind of in low numbers because a lot of them are out over the ocean. And then they move up during the breeding season, and we see them up here across the continent. So then we can start to turn on some of the different data layers here that show the movements of individual birds. So we've got 2 kinds. These purple ones are low precision ones. So these are usually ones from light level geolocators. So light level geolocators work by recording light levels. They're a tag that you put out on a bird, and it records the light levels that the bird's exposed to for every day that bird is out there. And what you can do then is you have to recapture the bird, take that tag off, And then you take those light levels and you can reconstruct sunrise and sunset time for every day the bird was out. And then just using astronomical equations, you can calculate the latitude and longitude for those time periods. Now, one of the challenges is that that technology isn't real accurate. And so we represent that with these relatively large circles, and they've got that sort of little halo around there to give you a sense of about how accurate they are. And so then we can watch these geolocator birds move across. So again, this will take just a little time for it to catch up here, but we can see these move across up on the breeding grounds, and then they head down. They disappear for a little bit there, and they disappear because during the equinox periods, we can't use the light level data to calculate location. So that's one of the limitations. So then we can also put on these yellow tags here. So these are individually tracked birds with high precision. So these are tags that work like GPS tags, basically with the same technology that's in your phone. Or also those MODIS tags that we talked about, where if the bird's tagged, it pings a tower, and then that tower records the exact location of that bird. It knows that it's within the immediate area of that tower. So we can see here, we've got the yellow ones that show up, and we can see a little bit more precise locations that those are moving with. So that gives you a sense for the location data and the migration maps. And I wanted to go and look at another map type, and that's the conservation challenges map. So these are the conservation challenges for a species, and I'm going to, in particular, look at coastal modification down here. And so in this case, what we've done is we've taken a map of areas that have coastal modification, and then we've overlaid it with that eBird status and trend maps. And what we're looking at then is places in darker red have more of the overlap between the bird distribution and coastal modification. So we can think that those areas where we see a lot of dark red are areas where we might expect there to be challenges from common terns being exposed to coastal modifications. And those are places where it's really important, where we think about what are the things that we can do to reduce those potential conflicts, or what are the things that we can do, like creating new nesting areas that are outside of areas that are impacted by coastal modification. Where are those opportunities? So this is something you can zoom into, and you can look at more detailed information. We can stop this. We can drag this one around, and we can get a sense for what does it look like in April, May, or what does it look like later in the breeding season, or even down here in September when these birds start to move through on migration. So again, thinking about that the places these birds are exposed to these different kinds of challenges are changing throughout the year. So that's one example. I'm going to go look at a different bird now. And we look at salt marsh sparrow. Okay, so salt marsh sparrow, another mid-Atlantic species, and very different in that it has a relatively short migration period distance compared to the common tern that we looked at earlier. So a couple things I'll show you here is, one, there's an area for related stories here. So if you click on this, it will bring you up some of the stories about salt marsh sparrows and perhaps their conservation or work that's going on in other areas to provide more habitat for them. So this is something to always keep your eye on over here. If there's any related stories here, you can open that up and see what those are. And then here, when we play the animated map, we can see the distribution again, based on the eBird maps and the hexagons of the entire population, and then what we know about movements coming from the yellow ones. And in this case, it's just the Modus Tower data is what we have for data there. So that's a relatively limited data set. We're only getting information when those birds pass by those Modus stations. So that's why you see them kind of blinking off and on in this case. And then I wanted to go look at conservation challenges. So this is what we did last time for common tern, but we'll look at a different one this time. We'll look at sea level rise. And we actually see something different here. So for sea level rise, we see that where the entire year, all of the sites are that dark purple color. And so it really shows that something like salt marsh sparrow is exposed to sea level rise throughout their full annual cycle, right? Breeding, migration, and overwintering, and really underlies the importance of any work around advocacy that we can do, either in terms of addressing climate change and trying to limit the amount of sea level rise that we have to manage for. We're also thinking about what can we do in terms of adaptation, and what can we do to make these areas that salt marsh sparrows depend on more resilient to sea level rise, and making sure that there's room for their habitat to migrate as sea level rise comes up. So those are some examples of the bird migration maps and how you can look up individual species. And really the thing there to do is to get in there and take a look at your favorite species and start exploring to see what's possible. So I wanted to switch now though and look at locations. And what this is a function is it's a way to take a single location, look it up, and then understand how it's connected to the rest of the hemisphere by migratory birds. So I'm going to look up Kittatinny. Okay. And so this then brings us up a map that is a hexagon map. And it shows us an individual location. And then the shade of purple around there is a measure of how many birds have been moved between this particular area that we called up and any other hexagon during some other part of the year. So we can look over here and we can get some basic statistics about where else in the hemisphere those migratory birds have gone to. And then by scrolling over, we can get some more detailed information about how many birds have moved from one place to another. So I'll just take here and actually before I move off of here, so this right now we're still just looking at Kittatinny, and we can do conservation sites near your chosen location, so we can expand that. Right away here, there's a way that people can click there, and one of the sites that comes up is Kittatinny Ridge, so they can click there and get more information about that site. But then we can go here and let's just sort of click this as a random cell down there. So that connects us to Georgia. So this particular hexagon is connected to this hexagon in Georgia by 108 birds of 22 species. And we can load all of those species and we can look up and down and you kind of get a sense of what it is. So it tends to be a lot of terrestrial species, which is what we'd expect. And just sort of gives you a sense, is that from tracking data? If it doesn't have tracking data, then that's probably coming from the banding information or the modus information. And then also we can go down here, we've got available maps. And we can learn more about Georgia if we want to look up more of that information. So that's one example. I'll just go in here and search for another example. We'll go to Erie, Pennsylvania, out on the lake. Again, it's going in, getting that information for that location. we can get a sense here, and then we can kind of go down here and check another area in Georgia, and then looking at the species that we're connected to, right away we see a lot more waterfowl. Remember last time we were looking at land birds mostly. Here we see a lot more waterfowl that are connecting that, and that's what we'd expect with Erie being right on the lake, and a lot more of that movement is by water birds. So that gives you a sense of how we can use that location tool to look at how birds are connecting a place to other places across the hemisphere, and then explore. Can explore down here, look at other spots in the Caribbean. Here we're looking at the Dominican Republic and looking at some of the species that have moved between there. So that's locations. And the final one I wanted to do was conservation challenges. So I showed you some examples of conservation challenges earlier where we entered through a species. And then for that particular species, we were able to look up conservation challenges. So this time I've gone to the conservation challenges section, and that is going to let us look at all the conservation challenges and then go and find the species that those are relevant to. So here we've got all of the different conservation challenges that we've mapped hemispherically. And I'll go down here and look at one of those. Let's look at light pollution. And so this starts by just bringing up a hemispheric map of light pollution. And then over here, we can look at species that light pollution is relevant for. And this is a lot of the nocturnal migrants that we need to be concerned about. So I'm going to go all the way down to the bottom here and give that a second to load up. Let's find wood thrush. There's the wood thrush. So I can then click on the wood thrush. And that brings us back to the species page. And now we're looking at the wood thrush species page and where are wood thrushes exposed to light pollution throughout their full annual cycle. So this will start to play again. And we see that overlap. And again, the larger the circles, the more birds are there, the darker red they are, the more overlap they have with light pollution. And so as we see the birds move north on migration, we can see that, across the eastern seaboard there's really an area where we've got a lot of overlap in terms of both the number of birds and also their overlap with light pollution. So that gives us a sense for, where are the areas where it's important to think about that we have lights out programs, and how can we help communicate about why those areas are important. And then we can also, if we're interested in a specific location and understanding how wood thrushes there are connected to other places, we can go on the species connection maps. So this was one that I didn't talk about earlier, but I'll talk about now. It's similar to the location map, except now instead of looking at all species, we're looking at just a single species. So we're just looking at wood thrushes. And if I click up here around Chesapeake Bay and click on that cell, then everything else that lights up, that's someplace where wood thrushes have moved from that cell to another cell during some point during the year. So we can see that, of course, they're migrating south, and then down in the overwintering area, they're in Belize, and down here into Nicaragua, El Salvador, and Honduras. So that you can then move around to other places, other cells, and get a sense of where we know about where those birds have moved. So here, the only connections that we know about for sure are between these three cells. So that's the species connection piece of the map, and that can help you articulate why a lights out program here has value to the conservation of birds down in this area as well. And also thinking about what do we need to do down here to make sure that we've are securing the overwintering areas as well, and that we have the partnerships in place to make that conservation possible. So that is an overview of how the Bird Migration Explorer works and what the different pieces are. And so I'll just go back to my slide deck here for just a second. And in closing, I just, wanted to talk a little bit about what the opportunities for all of you to be involved with this. One is contributing data. So like I said, if you have ever contributed an eBird checklist, that effort is represented in the Bird Migration Explorer. And those eBird distribution maps that are developed by the Cornell Lab of Ornithology are really an incredible resource. And the ability to take those observations that birders submit and change and convert those into these weekly abundance maps is really just an incredible resource for ornithology and bird conservation. And also, volunteering at a banding station. If any of you have ever had a chance to do that, it's really a special opportunity, and it generates the type of data that go in here and help us understand some of those bird movements. Use the Explorer. Engage Audubon members and other people in understanding bird movements and helping influence conservation decisions that are out there, and providing the context for people about why those decisions matter, both at the local site and also to where those birds move across the hemisphere. Sharing the Explorer with people and telling us how you're using it. The Bird Migration Explorer is really just, it's only as useful as it is to you and what you're able to do with it and what you might want to be able to do with it in the future. So feel free to send an email to migratorybirds@audubon.org and let us know if there's something that you've done with it that you think is really exciting, or if you think there might be something in there in the future that would be an important improvement. And then, participating in webinars or trainings like this. And so we'll be announcing more of these. And certainly if there are people that you think should know about the Bird Migration Explorer and what the opportunities are, all of those are important for us to know about. And again, you can email the same email and provide those opportunities, and we can try and connect you with somebody that can help on that. And so finally, I just wanted to say thank you again, and I'll stay on and answer questions here, but also really encourage you to take the time to go look up your favorite species, find out what you can learn about it, look up your favorite places, see how it's represented there, and start to learn more about bird migration across the hemisphere.
Thank you so much. This was great. I think we had one question. Lisa said, right now, folks in Maryland are excited to see a ferruginous hawk that's been tracked across Ohio to Pennsylvania and possibly to Maryland. How can we find out about this particular hawk? Is this something this tool can do?
Yeah, so the way that the Bird Migration Explorer works is the researchers collect tracking data, and then they put those tracking data into a data repository. And that's a place where that makes data available for all sorts of scientists. And then we connect with that researcher and get their permission to use that data, and then they share it through that data repository. So the live data from that ferruginous hawk that's starting to move from Ohio out to Pennsylvania, that one wouldn't necessarily be in the Data Migration Explorer right now, in the Bird Migration Explorer right now. It would likely show up in a data update down the road if that researcher shared the data with us. But what you could do is look up ferruginous hawks on the Bird Migration Explorer and get a sense for how unusual it would be for that bird to move from one location to another, and how how unusual that would be. So, and that's kind of a neat thing in terms of thinking about vagrants. Looking at the Bird Migration Explorer can give you a sense for how unusual some of those movements are and how infrequently they've been documented.
Thank you so much. Another great question from Molly. When Audubon has talked to policymakers about policy using this tool, has it been more effective to use specific bird examples to make policy points? It seems like maybe all this great data might be overwhelming for someone.
Absolutely. So I think the opportunities, like, really, I think, and this is true of a lot of education and outreach, is understanding what's most relevant to your audience. And for the policy folks that you're talking to, what would be the information that would be most useful to them and most compelling to them. So, some of the examples that have been important have been thinking about, what should the policy stance for one location be on something that's going on someplace else. And so if we're thinking about something that might seem far away, right? Like oil exploration in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, the Explorer can help us understand where those birds are moving to, and recognizing that even though the Arctic might seem like a long ways away from a bird migration perspective, it's actually on all of our many of our backyards.
Yeah, thank you so much. If anyone has any other questions, feel free to put them in the chat. I'm also going to put a link. I'll email folks with this too, but I'm going to put a link to a really short survey. I'm just trying to gather some information about these webinars that Mid-Atlantic has been hosting, to see if people want more of them, who you'd like to hear from, what you'd like to learn about. So feel free to fill that out. It'd be really helpful. There's another question here. Catherine says, based on the data gathered in the app, has there been any conservation projects started for specific bird species? That's a great question.
Not for, I don't think any particular bird species, but one of the things that we have done is we've made more of an effort to put up Modis towers. And by towers, they're not, they look like a large TV antenna or a weather station. They're not really a tower. They're more like a TV antenna you'd have on your house back before we all cut our cables. Recognizing I'm dating myself there a little bit. But these Modis stations, one of the things that the Migratory Bird Initiative has been doing is connecting with Audubon centers where possible and installing Modis stations at the centers. And so by doing that, there's both the opportunity for tagging projects that might happen nearby to take advantage of that Modis tower that's there to help understand bird movements. And then also for birds that are tagged someplace else, we'll know if those are moving through. So there's been a number of those that have gone up recently. So that's one example. And then, there's a lot of one of the things that we've done in pulling together all of the information in one place and doing that with some other science partners, specifically at the Smithsonian Institution and Georgetown University, is we've been working on a review paper where we have gone through and tried to get a handle on how many tracking data sets are out there and what species are better tracked than others and why that might be, and what some of the opportunities are to start filling in those gaps. So we've been working on some of those projects with other researchers.
Well, thank you so much. If there are no more questions, I'm gonna thank you all for coming, and I'll be around, but if you want to hop off, that's fine. Thanks for coming, and I hope everyone has a lovely evening.